The morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Seattle's glass-covered buildings as Special Agent Rodriguez sipped his third coffee of the day. The bustling city was just waking up, with sleepy office workers shuffling into their buildings clutching paper cups and breakfast bags. But Rodriguez wasn't there for the morning show. He had spent the last 8 months building a case against a sophisticated cybercrime ring operating from the shiny tech company headquarters across the street. Sitting in the corner of the small cafe, he looked like any other businessman starting his day. His dark suit was perfectly pressed, and his backpack, containing thousands of dollars worth of surveillance equipment, sat casually by his feet. 15 years with the FBI had taught him that the best way to blend in was to act like you belonged. Through the cafe's window, he watched the Target building's main entrance. His team had intel suggesting that today was when the cybercriminals would attempt to breach the company's secure servers. The operation had to be perfect. Too many people's personal data was at stake. He occasionally reached down to check his backpack, ensuring the monitoring equipment was still running smoothly. The cafe had started filling up with the morning crowd. A group of college students claimed the table next to him, their laptops open and textbooks spread out. 2 elderly men argued good-naturedly over a chess game in the opposite corner. The young barista behind the counter was creating elaborate latte art, calling out orders with cheerful energy. Rodriguez tapped his coffee cup twice, a signal to his surveillance team parked 2 blocks away that everything was still clear. His earpiece crackled softly as his partner confirmed the message. Years of experience had made these subtle movements second nature to him. To anyone watching, he was just another customer fidgeting with his cup. He pulled out his phone, pretending to check emails while actually monitoring the specialized tracking software his tech team had developed. The screen showed multiple dots moving around the Target building, each representing a person of interest in their investigation. One particular dot, labeled only as primary, had just entered the building's lobby. The morning light caught the edge of his FBI badge, safely hidden beneath his jacket. Rodriguez adjusted his position slightly, remembering his first undercover operation all those years ago. How nervous he'd been then, every movement feeling forced and obvious. Now, patience and observation were as natural as breathing. The cafe's bell chimed as more customers walked in, bringing with them the sounds of traffic and the cool morning air. Rodriguez noticed one woman giving him concerned glances as she waited for her order. He knew that look. Someone trying to decide if they should be worried. He'd seen it countless times before, but he kept his expression neutral and relaxed, exactly as he'd been trained. His watch showed 8:47 a.m. In exactly 13 minutes, according to their intelligence, the cybercrime team would make their move. The weight of his responsibility settled on his shoulders. Protecting thousands of innocent people's data, their financial security, their privacy. But this was why he'd joined the Bureau in the first place, to protect people who would never know they were being protected. The surveillance equipment in his backpack hummed softly, recording every digital signal in the area. Each piece had been carefully chosen and configured for this specific operation. One wrong move, one moment of carelessness, and months of careful planning could unravel. But Rodriguez remained calm, his exterior showing nothing but a man enjoying his morning coffee while checking his phone. Little did he know that his carefully maintained cover was about to be shattered, and this ordinary morning would become anything but routine. The morning calm in the cafe shattered when a woman in a pink blazer noticed something that made her heart race. She'd been watching the man in the corner for the past 20 minutes, and everything about him seemed off to her. The way he kept checking his backpack, his constant glances at the building across the street, how he barely touched his coffee. It all added up to something in her mind. She wasn't trying to cause trouble. Really, she wasn't. But these days, you couldn't be too careful, right? That's what all the see something, say something posters were about. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled out her phone and stepped outside the cafe, away from the morning bustle. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was steady and professional. I'm at the downtown coffee house on 5th Street, she whispered, glancing back through the window. There's a man here. He keeps watching the tech building across the street and checking his backpack. I think he might be planning something. The dispatcher's questions came quickly. What was he wearing? Had he spoken to anyone? How long had he been there? Each answer seemed to heighten the dispatcher's concern. Within minutes, the call was flagged and escalated to SWAT. In their command center, officers quickly pulled up security camera feeds from the area. Back in the cafe, Rodriguez remained focused on his mission, unaware of the wheels now turning against him. His surveillance equipment picked up increased radio chatter, but he assumed it was related to normal morning police activity. His years of training had taught him to stay calm, stay focused, and trust his instincts. Right now, those instincts were fixed on the cybercrime operation he'd spent months preparing for. The first sign that something was wrong came when he noticed people hurriedly leaving the cafe. The barista's cheerful demeanor had changed to nervous glances toward the window. The chess players in the corner quietly packed up their game, leaving their coffees half-finished. Rodriguez's training kicked in. Something had spooked them. Outside, SWAT teams were already moving into position. Their commander, receiving updates through his earpiece, coordinated the response. From their perspective, the situation checked every box on their threat assessment list. Suspicious behavior, strategic location, potential device in a backpack, proximity to high-value targets. The woman who made the call watched from behind a newspaper stand across the street, her heart pounding. She'd done the right thing, hadn't she? But as she saw the scale of the response building up, a seed of doubt began to grow in her stomach. Street vendors suddenly closed their carts. Office workers were quietly ushered away from windows. The normal morning symphony of city noise dimmed to an eerie quiet, broken only by the soft sounds of tactical teams getting into position. Rodriguez noticed the change in atmosphere. His training screamed at him that something was wrong, but moving now could compromise months of work. The cybercrime team was minutes away from making their move. He reached down one more time to check his equipment, and that's when he saw the laser sight dancing across his chest. Through the cafe window, he could now make out the tactical teams in position. Years of experience told him exactly what was about to happen. In that moment, he had to make an impossible choice: reveal his identity and blow the operation, or comply with what was coming and hope his team could salvage the mission. The quiet morning erupted into chaos as SWAT officers burst into the cafe, their commands echoing off the walls. For Rodriguez, time seemed to slow down. He could see the fear in their eyes, the tension in their movements, the split-second decisions being made. In that moment, he was no longer a veteran FBI agent, but simply a man being judged by appearances and assumptions. The world watched through smartphone cameras as another morning in America took an unexpected turn, not knowing that every person involved thought they were doing the right thing. The city street had transformed into something from an action movie. Police cars blocked both ends of the block, their lights painting the buildings in rotating red and blue. The SWAT team had taken up positions behind their vehicles, fingers steady on triggers, eyes locked on the cafe. Inside, Rodriguez could hear his FBI team through his earpiece, their voices urgent as they realized what was happening. "Sir, we have eyes on the situation. Should we intervene?" His partner's voice crackled through the tiny speaker. Rodriguez couldn't respond. Any sudden movement now could make things worse. Through the cafe's windows, he could see people on the street pulling out their phones, recording everything. Some looked scared, others curious, and a few seemed angry at the heavy police presence. This scene was about to go viral, and he knew it. The SWAT commander raised his bullhorn. "This is the police. Everyone inside the cafe, exit slowly with your hands visible." His voice boomed across the suddenly silent street. The remaining customers inside the cafe looked at each other in panic, then at Rodriguez, then at the door. The young barista went first, hands trembling above her head, then a couple who'd been sitting near the window. Each person was quickly escorted away by officers in tactical gear. Rodriguez stayed seated, his mind racing through options. The cyber criminals across the street would be starting their operation any minute now. Everything he'd worked for was slipping away. Through his earpiece, he could hear the surveillance van picking up increased activity in the target building. The criminals were making their move, completely unaware of the drama unfolding across the street. 8 months of investigation, countless hours of surveillance, and the careful building of evidence, all of it was about to go up in smoke. Last warning. Come out with your hands up. The commander's voice had an edge of tension now. Rodriguez looked down at his backpack, knowing the sophisticated equipment inside would only make things more complicated when they found it. He could hear the heavy boots of SWAT officers approaching the cafe's entrance. The morning sun caught their helmet visors, making them look almost robotic. His FBI training kicked in. Clear, slow movements, no sudden gestures. "I'm standing up now," he called out, his voice steady and professional. "I'm going to keep my hands where you can see them." He rose slowly from his chair, hands raised to shoulder height. The SWAT team burst through the door, weapons trained on him. "On your knees, hands behind your head." The lead officer's command echoed off the cafe walls. Rodriguez complied, feeling the cold floor through his suit pants. His years of training helped him stay calm, but he couldn't help thinking about how this scene would look on the evening news. "There's a backpack under the table," one officer called out, causing another wave of tension to ripple through the team. Rodriguez could feel the weight of their fear and suspicion. He'd been on their side of similar situations before, but experiencing it from this angle was surreal. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. Phones recorded every moment as Rodriguez was handcuffed and carefully searched. He could hear snippets of conversation from the onlookers, some questioning the police response, others defending it, all of them jumping to conclusions without knowing the full story. The SWAT team's bomb specialist approached the backpack cautiously, treating it like it might explode at any moment. Rodriguez wanted to tell them about the thousands of dollars worth of FBI surveillance equipment inside, but he knew that right now, silence was his safest option. Through his earpiece, still unnoticed by the SWAT team, he could hear his FBI colleagues scrambling to respond. They were caught in an impossible situation: reveal the operation to save their colleague, or let the scene play out and possibly lose their only chance to catch the cyber criminals. The morning sun continued to climb higher, casting harsh shadows across the scene, as downtown Seattle watched a misunderstanding spiral into a media sensation. Nobody involved could have guessed how this day would end, or how it would change their lives forever. The tension in the cafe could be cut with a knife. Rodriguez knelt on the cold floor, hands secured behind his back, while the SWAT team moved with practiced precision around him. The bomb specialist had carefully opened his backpack, expecting the worst. Instead, they found a sophisticated array of electronics that only raised more questions. "Sir, what's the purpose of this equipment?" the lead officer asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Before Rodriguez could answer, another officer called out from near the window. Movement in the target building. Multiple individuals entering the secure server room. The surveillance equipment in the backpack was still running, still feeding information about the cyber criminals' movements. Rodriguez could only watch as months of work slipped away. Through his hidden earpiece, he could hear his FBI team's frantic discussions. "We're losing them. We need to move now." His partner's voice was desperate. The cyber criminals were about to steal millions of dollars worth of data, and here he was, handcuffed on a cafe floor. The crowd outside had grown larger, their phones recording every moment. Someone had started a live stream, and comments were pouring in from around the world. Some defended the police response, others condemned it. But nobody knew the real story unfolding before their eyes. "I'm a federal agent," Rodriguez said calmly, keeping his voice steady despite the circumstances. "My credentials are in my inside jacket pocket. I'm asking you to check them now. There's an active operation in progress that we're about to lose." The SWAT commander hesitated. In his 15 years on the force, he'd heard every story imaginable from suspects. But something in Rodriguez's voice made him pause. He nodded to one of his officers, who carefully reached into Rodriguez's jacket. The moment the officer pulled out the FBI badge, the entire mood in the room shifted. The SWAT team exchanged nervous glances. The commander's face went pale as he realized the situation they'd walked into. Outside, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the police barrier. A woman in a sharp suit stepped out, holding up her own FBI credentials. The crowd parted as she strode toward the cafe, her face set in a mask of controlled anger. Back inside, Rodriguez could see the cyber-criminal signals moving on his equipment's display. They were finishing their operation, probably wondering why no one had stopped them. All this fancy equipment, months of planning, and he was powerless to act. "Those are our suspects leaving the building right now," he said, nodding toward the window. "While you've had me down here, they've been carrying out a major cyber theft. We need to move now." The SWAT commander was already barking orders into his radio, trying to coordinate with street units to intercept the suspects. But Rodriguez knew it was too late. In the cyber world, seconds meant everything, and they'd lost precious minutes. The FBI supervisor burst through the cafe door, her badge held high. "Release him now." Her voice cut through the chaos like a knife. The SWAT team scrambled to comply, one officer quickly removing Rodriguez's handcuffs. As he stood up, rubbing his wrists, Rodriguez could see the scene through the eyes of the bystanders outside. Their phones were still recording, capturing every moment of this misunderstanding turned fiasco. He knew this incident would spark conversations across the country, but right now, he had a job to finish. "Get me that equipment up and running again," he ordered, his focus returning to the mission. The same SWAT officers who had treated him as a threat moments ago now moved to help, their earlier suspicion replaced by professional respect, and more than a little embarrassment. The morning sun now streamed fully through the cafe windows, illuminating the faces of everyone involved. The SWAT team, the FBI agents, the onlookers outside. Each person's expression told a different story of assumptions, fear, duty, and realization. This day would change them all, though none of them yet knew exactly how. The cafe had become command central for both FBI and SWAT teams. Rodriguez's surveillance equipment was spread across what had been a peaceful breakfast table just an hour ago. The smell of spilled coffee mixed with the tension in the air as both teams tried to salvage what they could of the operation. "Replay the last 30 minutes of surveillance," Rodriguez instructed, his fingers flying over the keyboard. The SWAT team huddled around, watching as data streams showed the cybercriminals completing their hack. Their faces showed a mix of regret and determination to help fix the situation they'd inadvertently created. The FBI supervisor was on her phone, her voice carrying across the cafe. "I want every traffic camera, every security feed from the past hour. These suspects don't leave the city." She paused, listening to the response. "No, I don't care about jurisdiction right now. We've already had enough problems with that today." Outside, the crowd had grown even larger. News vans were starting to arrive, their satellite dishes reaching into the sky like metal trees. Reporters stood in front of cameras, gesturing toward the cafe, while speaking urgently into their microphones. The story was spreading faster than anyone could control it. The woman who had made the initial 911 call still stood across the street, her face pale as she watched the scene unfold. A young reporter had found her, microphone in hand, asking for her side of the story. She kept shaking her head, her eyes fixed on the cafe window where Rodriguez now worked alongside the same officers who had handcuffed him. Inside, Rodriguez's equipment suddenly beeped. "Got something," he called out, and everyone crowded around his screen. "They're trying to transfer the stolen data through a series of proxy servers. They think they're being clever, but they're leaving breadcrumbs." The SWAT commander leaned in, his tactical gear brushing against Rodriguez's shoulder. The earlier tension between them had been replaced by professional focus. "What do you need from us?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine respect now. "Your team knows this city better than anyone," Rodriguez replied, not taking his eyes off the screen. "When I trace this to their physical location, we'll need fast response times. No mistakes this time." The commander nodded, already coordinating with his team through hand signals. The young barista, who had been allowed to return to the cafe, brought fresh coffee for everyone. Her hands were steadier now as she served the officers who had earlier ordered her to evacuate. She paused by Rodriguez's table. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I saw everything that happened." Rodriguez looked up from his work, giving her a gentle smile. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do. Stay alert, report suspicious activity. The system isn't perfect, but we're all trying to make it better." His words seemed to lift a weight from her shoulders. The FBI supervisor ended her phone call and approached the group. "The media's running with the story," she announced. "Social media's blowing up. We need to contain this, but first, we need to catch these criminals. What's our status?" Rodriguez pointed to his screen, where a map of the city was now displayed with a blinking red dot. "They're good with computers, but they're amateurs at hiding in the real world. They're holed up in a rental office 3 blocks from here, probably thinking they're safe behind their firewalls." The SWAT commander immediately began outlining a tactical approach, his earlier embarrassment forgotten in the face of action. His team gathered around, listening intently as he laid out their roles. This time, they would be working with the FBI, not against them. Through the cafe window, the morning sun illuminated the scene. Law enforcement officers from different agencies working together, technology and tactical expertise combining, past mistakes being turned into future lessons. The day was far from over, and the story was about to take another turn that would capture the nation's attention. The FBI supervisor's heels clicked against the sidewalk as she marched towards the gathering of city officials near the police line. Behind her, the cafe had transformed into a joint operations center, with FBI agents and SWAT team members working side by side. The morning's hostility had been replaced by focused cooperation. "We have a serious situation," she announced to the assembled officials. "We're dealing with a cyber theft in progress, and the media circus out there is only making our job harder." She gestured toward the news vans that now lined both sides of the street. Reporters were broadcasting live, their cameras capturing every movement in and out of the cafe. Inside, Rodriguez was coordinating with both teams, his fingers dancing across his laptop keyboard. The surveillance equipment that had earlier been treated as suspicious was now their best hope of catching the criminals. "They're starting to move the stolen data," he called out. "Time's running out." The SWAT commander stood behind him, watching the screen intently. His radio crackled with updates from his teams, now positioned around the suspect's location. "My men are in place," he said quietly. "Just say the word." The weight of their earlier mistake hung heavy in his voice. Outside the cafe, the woman who made the initial 911 call was being interviewed by a sympathetic reporter. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice trembling. "But look what happened. Look what I caused." The reporter nodded understanding, but her eyes were drawn to the cafe window where Rodriguez continued his work. The young barista had started making fresh coffee for everyone again, this time with steady hands and purpose in her movements. She paused near Rodriguez's table, listening as he explained the cyber tracking process to the SWAT team. His patience and professionalism, even after everything that had happened, left a deep impression on her. "Got them." Rodriguez's voice cut through the buzz of activity. Everyone gathered around his laptop. "They're trying to transfer the data through an overseas server, but I've pinpointed their exact location." He pointed to a blinking dot on the map, just 3 blocks away. The SWAT commander immediately sprang into action, his radio coming to life with crisp, precise commands. His team had something to prove now, and they were determined to get it right. "All units prepare for coordinated entry. FBI has point on this one." Through the cafe window, the gathering crowd watched as FBI agents and SWAT team members moved with purpose toward their vehicles. The same officers who had earlier treated Rodriguez as a threat were now following his lead, their earlier prejudices replaced by professional respect. The FBI supervisor returned to the cafe, her face set with determination. "The mayor's office is involved now," she announced. "This incident is going to lead to some serious discussions about law enforcement protocols." She looked at Rodriguez, who was packing up his equipment. "But first, we have criminals to catch." The young barista approached Rodriguez one last time before he left. "Will you come back?" she asked. "Maybe when all this is over. Free coffee for life." Her offer brought a genuine smile to his face, the first one since this whole ordeal began. "Count on it," he replied, securing his backpack. The same one that had caused so much trouble earlier. Sometimes good things can come from bad situations. He looked around the cafe, now a symbol of how quickly things could change, for better or worse. As the joint team prepared to move out, the morning sun caught the FBI and SWAT badges side by side, their metal surfaces reflecting light in the same way. The crowd outside had grown quiet, sensing that something important was about to happen. News cameras followed every movement, but the story they would tell later would only be part of what really happened in that cafe on this extraordinary morning. The day that had started with fear and prejudice was transforming into something else, a lesson about assumptions, cooperation, and the importance of seeing beyond first impressions. And it wasn't over yet. The afternoon sun beat down on the joint FBI-SWAT operation as they surrounded the office building. The cyber criminals were holed up on the 4th floor, still unaware that their location had been discovered. Rodriguez, now wearing a tactical vest over his suit, stood with the command team behind a police barrier. "Team 1 in position," crackled the radio. "Team 2 ready." The SWAT commander looked at Rodriguez, waiting for his signal. Just hours ago, they'd been on opposite sides of a tense situation. Now they moved like a well-oiled machine, each bringing their expertise to the table. Through his laptop, Rodriguez monitored the criminals' digital activity. "They're starting to delete their tracks," he announced. "They must have spotted something." His fingers flew over the keyboard, trying to preserve as much evidence as possible. The stolen data from the tech company was worth millions, but the real damage would be to people's private information. The woman who had made the 911 call watched from behind the police line, along with hundreds of other onlookers. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras zooming in on the scene. Social media was exploding with live updates, but few knew the full story of how the morning's prejudice had almost let these criminals escape. "All teams go." The command rang out across all channels. The coordinated entry was a sight to behold. SWAT teams breaching from the stairwell, while FBI agents secured the exits. The crowd held their breath, phones raised high to record every moment. Inside the building, the sound of doors being breached echoed through the hallways. The cyber criminals, caught completely off guard, barely had time to react. They'd spent so much time covering their digital tracks that they'd forgotten about the real world. "FBI. Freeze." The lead agent's voice boomed through the office space. 3 suspects sat surrounded by computers, their faces showing shock as both FBI agents and SWAT team members flooded the room. The same tactical precision that had been mistakenly used against Rodriguez earlier was now serving its true purpose. Down on the street, Rodriguez watched the operation unfold through the building's security cameras that his team had accessed. The young barista from the cafe had brought coffee for everyone at the command post, refusing to take payment. "Consider it a small way of making things right," she said, her eyes reflecting the day's events. The FBI supervisor was already coordinating with cybercrime specialists who would secure the suspects' computers. Every second counted. Digital evidence could be wiped in moments, but they'd learned something about rushing to judgment today, about the importance of seeing the whole picture. News reporters crowded around the police line, eager for statements. The story had evolved from one of potential terrorism to a complex tale of prejudice, redemption, and cooperation. Social media was filled with clips of the morning's incident at the cafe, now contrasted with images of FBI and SWAT working together. "Suspects secured. came the radio call everyone had been waiting for. Evidence preserved. A cheer went up from the crowd, though many of them didn't fully understand what had been prevented. The real victory wasn't just in catching the criminals. It was in how law enforcement had overcome their morning's mistake to work together. The suspects were led out in handcuffs, looking nothing like the dangerous terrorists someone had imagined Rodriguez to be. They were just ordinary people who had chosen to do wrong, proving once again how appearances could be deceiving. Local news cameras captured the scene as Rodriguez worked alongside the SWAT commander, their earlier confrontation transformed into professional respect. The day's events would spark important conversations about bias and judgment, but right now, they were just two law enforcement officers doing their jobs. The afternoon sun caught the FBI and SWAT badges as both teams secured the scene, a reminder that beneath different uniforms, they all served the same purpose: to protect and serve, hopefully now with a better understanding of the importance of looking beyond first impressions. Back at FBI headquarters, the afternoon sun streamed through tall windows into a packed conference room. Police chiefs, FBI officials, and city leaders sat around a long table, their faces serious as they reviewed footage from the morning's events. The incident had sparked a firestorm of public attention, and now it was time to face the consequences. "We need to address this head-on," the FBI supervisor said, standing at the front of the room. The screens behind her showed news coverage from different channels, all telling slightly different versions of the same story. Social media is calling this a wake-up call for law enforcement everywhere. Rodriguez sat quietly, watching as clips from the cafe incident played on the screens. It felt surreal seeing himself on the news, watching as cameras captured his detention and the eventual revelation of his identity. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from fellow agents across the country. The SWAT commander spoke next, his tactical gear replaced by a formal uniform. "Our team followed protocol, but clearly, those protocols need review." He paused, looking directly at Rodriguez. "We're trained to act quickly, but today showed us the cost of acting without all the facts." Outside the building, reporters camped out on the sidewalk, hoping for statements from anyone involved. The story had gone national, with social media debates raging about law enforcement practices, racial profiling, and the importance of interagency communication. The young barista from the cafe had been invited to speak at the meeting, sharing her perspective as a civilian witness. "I watched everything happen," she said, her voice steady despite the high-ranking audience. "What struck me most was how quickly everyone moved from conflict to cooperation once the truth came out." The woman who made the 911 call had also been asked to share her thoughts. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "I thought I was doing my civic duty," she said, emotion clear in her voice. "But I never stopped to question my own assumptions. That's something we all need to think about." The police chief leaned forward in his chair. "We're implementing immediate changes to our response protocols," he announced. "Better communication between agencies, more thorough verification procedures, and most importantly, training that addresses unconscious bias." Rodriguez finally stood to address the room. The same people who had gathered to dissect the morning's mistakes now listened intently to his perspective. "What happened today wasn't just about me," he began. "It's about how quick judgments can cascade into dangerous situations." The tech company's CEO joined the meeting virtually, his face serious on the large screen. "If not for the quick recovery after the initial misunderstanding," he chose his words carefully, "we could have lost millions in customer data. Sometimes our worst moments lead to our best improvements." As the meeting continued, staff brought in coffee from the same cafe where everything had started. It felt like a small but significant gesture of healing. The barista had insisted on preparing it herself, adding a note that read, "To those who protect us, even when we don't understand how." The FBI supervisor shared the preliminary findings from their internal review. "This incident exposed gaps in our system," she admitted, "but it also showed how quickly we can adapt and improve when we acknowledge our mistakes." Outside, the afternoon was fading into evening, but the media crews showed no signs of leaving. This story had touched a nerve in the national conversation, becoming more than just another headline about law enforcement and bias. City officials were already drafting new guidelines for emergency response situations. The SWAT team had volunteered for additional training sessions. Even the cafe had become a symbol of change, with people from all walks of life stopping by to discuss what had happened. The meetings would continue for days, the policy changes for months, but something fundamental had shifted in those few dramatic hours. A potential tragedy had transformed into an opportunity for growth, understanding, and real change. 1 month after the incident, the downtown cafe had become more than just a coffee shop. People from all walks of life gathered there, drawn by the story of what had happened that morning. The young barista had kept her promise. Rodriguez's coffee was always on the house. That morning, he sat at his usual corner table, this time surrounded by a mix of FBI agents and SWAT team members. They weren't there for an operation, but for something more important, the first session of a new joint training program that had grown out of their experience. "We learned more from one morning than from years of standard training," the SWAT commander said, addressing the group. The same officers who had once stormed in with weapons drawn now sat comfortably, sharing stories and insights with their FBI counterparts. Sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our best improvements. Through the window, they could see film crews setting up their equipment. A major news network was doing a follow-up story on how the incident had changed police practices across the country. The woman who had made the 911 call had been invited to share her story as part of a national campaign about conscious awareness and community responsibility. "The cyber criminals we caught that day," Rodriguez explained to the group, "they were just the beginning. The real story was about how we handled our mistakes and what we learned from them." His laptop showed updates from police departments nationwide that had adopted the new protocols developed after the incident. The cafe's walls now displayed framed newspaper articles about that day, alongside photographs showing the transformation from confrontation to cooperation. The young barista had created a special board where customers could share their own stories of assumptions challenged and lessons learned. Outside, a group of police academy trainees walked past, heading into the building for their morning session. Their training now included a detailed study of what had happened that day, not just the tactical mistakes, but the human elements that had led to them. The FBI supervisor arrived, carrying folders filled with the latest statistics. "Reports of similar incidents have dropped by 40% since we implemented the new protocols," she announced. The room buzzed with quiet satisfaction. Real change was happening, one department at a time. At another table, the tech company's security team met with law enforcement representatives, sharing insights about how physical and cybersecurity could work together better. The incident had opened new channels of communication between agencies that had once operated in isolation. "Remember when this was just a coffee shop?" the barista asked, bringing fresh refills to the table. The cafe had become a symbol of positive change, a place where difficult conversations could happen openly and honestly. Even the regular customers had become part of the story, sharing their perspectives with newcomers who asked about the framed articles. Rodriguez looked around the room, taking in the scene. FBI agents chatted with SWAT team members about family and weekend plans. The woman who had made the 911 call now volunteered with community outreach programs, helping others understand the impact of unconscious bias. As the afternoon sun painted the cafe in warm light, a group of young officers stopped by for coffee. They nodded respectfully to Rodriguez and the others, knowing the story that had changed their training and perhaps their entire approach to law enforcement. The day's last training session was winding down, but the impact of what had happened in this cafe would continue. The incident had become a case study in police academies, a talking point in community meetings, and most importantly, a reminder that behind every badge and every citizen was a human being deserving of understanding and respect. "Same time next week?" the SWAT commander asked as they packed up their materials. The question carried more weight than just scheduling. It was about continuing the work they'd started, about making sure the lessons learned that morning wouldn't be forgotten. Outside, the city moved on with its daily rhythm, but something had changed. In police stations, dispatch centers, and coffee shops across the country, people were learning to pause, think, and look beyond their first impressions. Sometimes the biggest changes start with a single morning in a small cafe, where a mistake became a movement.